The purpose of the Vision series is, quite frankly, to showcase Mason faculty in a wide variety of fields. Mason faculty who do interesting research and outreach, and who also have the capacity to talk about it engagingly. We hope that these Visions lectures will interest a significant segment of the university community and of the regional community, going beyond the audience that tends to accumulate simply around specialized presentations in their own discipline. So I do welcome you. We're venturing 2 Vision Series lectures in Arlington this year. The next one will be March 5th on intelligent design and why it should not be taught in the schools. You can come and protest if you wish. If, as I hope, we find community interest developing, we'll be very happy to offer a somewhat larger slate of presentations in Arlington next year. We've found that the series works very well on the whole, and again, thank you very much for attending this inaugural presentation. It's a pleasure, and this is my second reason for being up here briefly, it's a pleasure, obviously, to introduce our speaker, Sandra Cheldelin, from the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution. Sandy received her PhD in education from the University of Florida. I have the year here, but I won't give it, although it's more recent than mine. Sandy has a experience in working with a really impressive array of institutions, universities, medical schools, corporations, religious institutions, and other organizations on a variety of topics in conflict analysis, including such topics as the development of a national policy for victims of violent crime and the implementations of neighborhood strategies for building community resilience. She also has an impressive record of work in international venues, ranging from Central Asia to Vietnam to Liberia. She's also one of my very favorite colleagues. I got to know her soon after I got here. We recurrently tried to persuade her to enter university administration. She has resolutely refused, which is another testament to her high intelligence. It's a pleasure to introduce Sandra Cheldelin.
Well, thank you, Peter, and hello all, and thank you all for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces, and I appreciate this far along in the semester that people are willing to give up an evening to consider this topic. Women, War, and Peace, it certainly is a current topic right now. I hope you've been watching the public television series on women, war, and peace. They've done an extraordinary job, and so far they've covered Bosnia and the Balkans, the Balkans and Liberia and Colombia. If you don't know about it, please check it out. It's at 11 o'clock at night. I'm not sure why it's at 11 o'clock at night. I think it's maybe because the women's work is done by then, or maybe they're not quite yet exhausted enough, or, well, anyway. So, at 11 o'clock at night, you can tape it, see it the next day, but the series is really quite extraordinary. I'd like to set the context about my experience at SCAR on this topic. 15 years ago, I came to Mason from Antioch. There were a number of interesting issues in that transition. In contrast to the greater Washington, D.C., I came from a village of 4,000, and its mainstay was Young's Dairy, which did have good ice cream. It was in the rural part of Ohio. 6.5 acres is what we lived on, and we had a 5-minute drive through the cornfields to get to work. Antioch, a small private liberal arts college, is politically liberal, sometimes probably called radical, has a board that's dominated by the alumni, and there are more women than men on the faculty. Large public university is George Mason. When I arrived, Ed Meese was the rector. The Board of Visitors, some of you don't know, are too young to know who Ed Meese was, but for those of us, anyway, yes. Anita's laughter captures it right. A political appointee dominant board, and at my institute at the time, this was called ICAR, we had one female colleague. What made it seamless, though, were the issues of social justice. Can you imagine having the mantra from your first president of the college say, "Be ashamed to die unless you've won some victory for humanity"? Whew. Well, then that came here, and it was basic human needs and problem-solving workshops. And so John Burton and Mann had similar kinds of issues of social justice. And so that made the transition a little easier. Early on at the Institute, I was surprised when one of my female colleagues suggested at the faculty board meeting that we should have a woman as our next annual Lynch lecture. The director said there wasn't anyone qualified. So she said, "Well, what about Elise Boulding?" And I thought, oh, I know who Elise Boulding is. We had just gotten Kenneth Boulding's library at Antioch. So, and then he said, well, she's already been a Lynch lecture, and she wouldn't, so we can't ask her again. And so what about so-and-so, whom I didn't know? And then she said, well, what about so-and-so? And he said, well, what about so-and-so? And this little tete-a-tete went on for about 3 or 4 exchanges. And finally, he said, the case is closed. No. So after the board meeting, I slipped into Wallace Warfield's office, as I often did then and for years to follow, and said, what was that all about? And his advice to me was, don't go there. It's complicated. Don't go there. Well, a surprise to me, as well as those who know you, I did not go there. I actually had too many other adjustments to work on those first 2 rocky years of transition. But 4 years later, my female colleague left, and I asked to teach her gender and conflict class. And that's when I decided to go there. This fall, I will complete my 11th year teaching that course. What a terrific experience this has been. And I'm so grateful I've had the opportunity. Over the years, with master's and doctoral students, we have explored gendered issues of protracted conflicts and violence. Students' culminating task is to develop their own theories of gender and conflict. All of the gender conflict topics are analyzed using a conflict analysis framework. Those of you who may not be familiar with it, here it is. We first determine the types, sources, and dynamics of the conflict. That's that inner circle. Examples would be an analysis of child marriage practices, or the use of small arms, or sex trafficking, and the like. And then we're forced to examine what we might not have considered, the situational nature of conflict and issues of identity. That's in that middle circle. Economic collapse might be a situational phenomenon, and location of gender as an identity issue. And then we explicitly explore the structural and cultural constraints that seem to sustain the conflicts, the outer circle, the impact of patriarchy, the legal and religious laws and traditions, for example, the International Criminal Court. And finally, we consider what an intervention might involve that would involve considering the complexities of these various embedded issues. Now, I've organized the course around the intersection of conflict and the essential social structures of society: economics, law, polity, as well as family, education, and religion. We've explored the public and private domains in various cultures, their persistence, and the ways to break out. This fall, we have a new book with chapters written by alumni, colleagues, and students, and I will shamelessly promote it. You have an opportunity to buy it if you want to after this session. This book is titled Women Waging War and Peace. So we came up with the title actually before the PBS series did. Tonight I'll be talking about women in 2 situations, with cases used to illustrate points. Women waging war as victims and as combatants, and then women as peacemakers. And I'll conclude with why gendered structural interventions are essential in our work, both in conflict analysis and in conflict resolution. The reason we're considering gender, war and violence, is that we know war and violence has a huge gendered agenda. My presentation focuses on women, but of course it's always within the context that include men. We all know the dominant war narrative, that iconic picture of children too. Women have one paramount story in this narrative. Women are essentially and overwhelmingly portrayed as the victims. Whether as mothers grieving for sons dead and missing, or as widows struggling to survive in male-dominated societies, as refugees displaced from their homes, communities, and countries, or as those raped, tortured, left physically impaired, psychologically distressed, shamed, humiliated, or dead. While the reality of this is widespread, and without doubt women and children are indeed adversely affected during war and its aftermath, this dominant version of the narrative that has several limitations and misconceptions. Chief among them is the idea that men are spared victimhood, and that women are limited to it. After all, men, especially civilians, are overwhelmingly the casualties of mass genocide. Take, for example, ways the Pakistani army responded to the Bengali bid for independence. They systematically ridded the country of boys and men who could or would one day become freedom fighters. The prevailing narrative also ignores how women's lives change as a result of war and other traumatic experiences, and how the women are able to forge creative strategies to survive those situations. When we frame the situation of women as victims, then we overlook women's capacity of agency, women adapting to new roles and transforming gender dynamics in the societies from which they come. That said, I'm still going to spend a few minutes talking about the dominant narrative of women as victims during war, to demonstrate why it's also profoundly true and why it is so hard to change. I'll focus on the sexual violence theme of the narrative, though equal time could be given to the refugee problem, the widow or fatherless children problem, the profound trauma of the community problem, and the like. Everyone here knows that in all wars, sexual violence during wartime happens. It's well documented. Whether the victors have taken and conquered women, have taken them home as sexual slaves, assault them as punishment for opponents' resistance, or use them to satisfy their sexual desires, or hold them hostage until impregnation, rape has and continues to threaten women and girls in every conflict. You know, we witness the underbelly of war in odd places. Nat Hentoff in the Village Voice responded to a New York Times editorial on the government of Sudan's terrorism against black Christians and tribesmen in the southern part of the country. The Times focused its story on the national Muslim military regime that had targeted black Africans. That as a result, more than 4 million southern Sudanese were displaced. Well, clearly this was an atrocity that's newsworthy. But so too was what was known to the editor, but not reported. The extraordinary personal horrors experienced by women like then 20-year-old Alo Deng. Her abduction story in southern Sudan was not random, it was commonplace. Enslaved during a raid in her village, she tried to run away from the soldiers. They caught her, threw her to the ground, held her hands and feet, cut her throat and chest with a knife. She fainted while they raped her. And it happened just about every day along the way. Spending years as a slave, where she also suffered repeated gang rapes, Deng finally escaped and was discovered in a displaced persons camp in southern Sudan. Why was this left out of the New York Times account of Sudan's terrorism? Are the horrors of women such as Deng not newsworthy? Moving from Sudan to Bosnia, we witness a 19-year-old woman living at home. The war began, and she hid in the basements in the army-occupied part of her country. One day, her luck ran out. She was found, and she was raped by the soldiers. When she learned she was pregnant, her father banned her from their home, though later stated that he would allow her to return if the baby was a boy. Again, a misfortune. The baby was a girl. She explained to her friend, when she looked into the baby's face, whom she loved more than anyone, what she saw was her rapist face, whom she despised more than anyone. The account of that story was not uncommon in 2003 and again in 2005 when I interviewed women at the Association of Concentration Camp Torture Survivors in Sarajevo. Though at that point, their situations were slightly more complicated. The children that resulted from their rapes were now pre-adolescents. Many of the women and the children were not welcome in their former communities, banned from their families, medically impaired, dealing with long-term psychological illnesses and depression, and economically desperate. It's so difficult to make the war rape story public. In her historical documentation of rape that occurred in Bangladesh in 1971, Brownmiller read in the New York Post that the government of Bangladesh was declaring all women raped by the Pakistani military officially heroines of the war, even though they should be shunned. This story actually intrigued her and launched her research. She asked a friend who worked on the foreign desk of the New York Times about the story on the rape of the Bengali women, and he merely laughed. "I don't think so. It doesn't sound like a Times story." Similarly, a friend at Newsweek told her, well, he's pretty skeptical. She got the distinct impression that both men, good journalists, thought that she was barking up an odd tree. NBC's Liz Trotter was one of the few American reporters to investigate the Bangladesh rape story. She filed a TV report for the Weekend News. Is this just Weekend News? Was Hentoff right in his omission that rape is not New York Times or Newsweek worthy? Let's consider the data provided by the UN. These data seem almost unimaginable. You'll see in the first one, Vietnam, from 1965 to 73, the number of women who were raped is unknown. Interesting that it's unknown. The 60s Project right now is trying to gather enough data to determine how many women actually were raped. But we do know in South Africa, approximately 25,000 were raped in the 1980s. In the Bosnia, Herzegovina, 1992 to 93, between 20 and 70,000 were raped. In Rwanda, in 1994, 250,000. In the Eastern Congo, we have 400,000 each year. And they are raped by uniformed armed forces and by civilians. So in the 35 countries currently in conflict, being a civilian woman in these countries will likely result in being violated. Let me repeat that. In the 35 countries currently in conflict, being a civilian woman will likely result in being violated. Well, in addition, we all know the booty thesis. This is a long-standing excuse for the persistence of rape during and after war. The rape of the enemy woman is accepted as fair game or as just reward for victory. The war booty thesis is remarkably chronicled in A Woman in Berlin, 8 Weeks in a Conquered City by a female German journalist who goes anonymous, and she was also a victim. She details the 2 months surrounding the arrival of the Soviet troops at the end of the war, where 100,000 German women were raped in Berlin by the Russian conquerors. She overheard a conversation between the Russian soldiers about Stalin's decree that seemed to suggest that Stalin had, quote, declared that this kind of thing, rape, is not to happen. Well, Stalin may not have endorsed the mass rape, but neither did he do anything to stop it. On the other side of the world, when the Japanese armed forces had access to hundreds of thousands of Koreans and Chinese as comfort women, these women were forced to provide sexual services to the Japanese. You may not know the rest of the part of the story. A day before the Japanese began their negotiation for the country's surrender and occupation, September 19, 1945, the Ibaraki police were told to set up service stations for the American GI occupation troops. They converted a police officer dormitory into a brothel, stocking it with 20 women. The next day, it was operating. For the cost of $1, the price of half a pack of cigarettes, paid up front, GIs received a ticket and a condom. When the first brothel opened, a line of more than 500 occupying GIs immediately formed. Each woman served 15 to 60 clients a day. And 7 months later, General MacArthur declared all places of prostitution off limits. His decision was likely informed by medical necessity, as nearly a quarter of the 35,000 troops had contacted sexually transmitted diseases. Not that the Korean or Chinese women were forced into prostitution. Of course, individual stories of horrific crimes demand an empathic response. But when we consider the collective stories, all the women raped and tortured and forced into prostitution in all the wars, it's clear that rape is a gendered crime and requires a comprehensive and persistent intervention. As rape has been more and more tactical and strategic during wartime, the horrors of such torture can no longer be dismissed. The war booty thesis is persistent over centuries, but the latter part of the 20th century is witness to something more sinister, the gendered war. It is mass rape at a deliberate state-sanctioned strategy of war to exterminate a race of people, also known as genocide, or a deliberate extermination of a particular sex or gender, known as gendercide. So here are 22 current and historical gendercide examples of 22 current or historical genocide cases. There seems to be some good news as a result of this awful picture, however. Rape has finally become a war crime. This is an important legal decision. Here we can thank the media. Their widespread focus on allegations of rape in the former Yugoslavia resulted in a significant increase in public awareness and support for measures that respond to the trauma and crime of rape and war. The UN has taken remarkable leadership here. From 1993 to 2000, here are some of the UN accomplishments. January 1993, UN Commission on Human Rights categorized rape as a war crime. That means there's no longer booty. May 1993 created an International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In 94, the Rwanda Tribunal was established. In 94, rape as war booty and genocide no longer was a natural part of war. In 1998, the creation of the International Criminal Court. July 2000, the famous FOCA trial in Bosnia. And in October 31st, 2000, the Resolution 1325. This resolution reaffirms the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and stresses equal participation in all efforts to promote peace and security. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So why is this victory, this 1325? Well, it's an important international political recognition that women and gender are relevant to international peace and security, and that it's the first to call for women's engagement in conflict resolution and in peace building, that women actually have a voice in this. So when we consider the ways to change the dominant narrative, legal structures are essential, though they are no panacea yet. Susan Hirsch, one of our colleagues here, has an excellent stories on the promises of justice in Uganda, the DRC, and Sudan, and an excellent critique of our current status with legal structures. We must have international laws with international consequences. There is much yet to be done here, even though, with laws in place to convict perpetrators, women must testify, they have to sign indictments, deal with the family and community fallout. If they admit rape, women cannot protect their children from rape or from suffering of the social stigmas. So there remains shame, the humiliation, the ultimate silence for the majority of women victims. I'd like to shift now from the victimhood issues of women waging war to combatants. Even though it's a common story that men fight the wars and women do the peacemaking, it's not the entirely true story. Did you know that in 55 different conflicts today, women have assumed active fighting roles? What's going on here? We've explored several of these cases in depth, asking such questions as, does power, or the lack of it, play a role in violentization of women? Is there something deeply rooted in their cultures that contribute as a source of their violence? Do circumstances in traditional patriarchal societies force some women to prove their worth on the battlefield and achieve some semblance of equality? Maneshka Iliatambe is here. Kate Romanova and Patricia Malden, who is also here, have studied women as well as their children as combatants. Eritrea, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Chechnya, Sierra Leone, and Liberia all have stories to inform us. I also recommend two compelling autobiographies from child soldiers, one based in Algeria, the story of I, Nadia, wife of a terrorist, and the other is based in Sierra Leone, A Long Way Gone, memoirs of a boy soldier. Bea's stories were the same as those we heard from the participants in our trauma work in Liberia. What do these cases tell us? Let's talk about the women. Thousands of women join armed groups as combatants, and they do so for various reasons. Many do so to achieve social emancipation. Some are victims of forced recruitment. Some may well be in agreement with the war goals, patriotism, religious, or ideological motives. Many lack educational opportunities and especially economic opportunities. Also, women believe they can and have proved their worth on the battlefield to achieve some semblance of equality. It could change their social status in day-to-day life. They see it as their only chance for survival. Seeking emancipation is often paired with fighting oppression. What happens to women who have been combatants or active participants in war? Well, the suicide bombers, the Black Widows of Chechnya and the Tamil Tigresses of Sri Lanka, take their own lives seeking emancipation. For those who did not take their lives, at war's end, many are forced to revert back to their earlier position in society. Consider the cultural icon in the US, Rosie the Riveter, declares, "We can do it." She represents an American woman who worked in factories during World War II that produced munitions and war supplies. Many of these women took on new jobs, replacing the male workers after war. Rosie is a symbol of women's economic power. However, these Rosies were expected to go back home when the war ended to resume their natural roles. Policies were established, in fact, to make sure that they did so. And so we had the life of the 1950s. Well, so too was the case in Eritrea. However, a decade into the war, these women joined the men on the front lines against the Ethiopian occupation of their country. By the end of the 30-year war, women were greater than 30% of the army. Many suggest that women joined the women fighting unit of Eritreans to show their power. As fighters, they could do the same thing as men. And surely, when they got back into society, they would be rewarded for doing so. They will be able to participate in every aspect of life. So they adopted a heightened level of violence to prove themselves, and they were recruited for the same reason. Because of their desire to prove themselves, it encouraged male soldiers to do their best. Here is an Eritrean man in telling of his own experience with women. This is a quote. "In the past, when I discovered that my female relatives, let alone my wife or even neighbors, had left the house without my consent, I used to beat them. I find it hard to believe the transformation which I've undergone. Look, my sister is discussing with me here, and we work alongside each other in the People's Assembly. It took a long time, but I've come not only to accept that the emancipation of women is necessary for the revolution, but to actively work for it." So what lessons can we take from this? Women are changed when they become combatants. Some are used to take their lives for the greater cause, the Black Tigresses, the Black Widows and Tigresses. Some are used to produce munitions and otherwise support war efforts. And some choose to be the catalyst for societal changes. In the US, women demonstrated that they could do the work. They helped run the country. They were empowered to do so. However, being forced to return to their homes, the 50s women was likely a significant source of the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s in reaction against this. In Eritrea, the quality of lives of women after the Civil War did change indeed. So did their society. A key change was land reform. Women became legal owners of property. Large tracts of land were redistributed and the landless and the poor peasants, and the women were given land in equal shares as to that of men. The quality of their lives changed also. Polygamy was officially abolished, compulsory marriage was illegal, women could divorce, and the laws would protect them. I'll now shift to the narratives that women are good peacemakers. Well, I like that storyline, and there's actually some evidence of truth to that. Let me explain this in two parts. The first acknowledges women intervening in war, and the second acknowledges women building sustainable peace. Many of us remember when the Institute for Inclusive Security was known as Women Waging Peace. Ambassador Swanee Hunt was the brainchild of this organization. Her story, building a peace network, is also chronicled in the book. Early on, she was moved by her work in the Balkans. Women were systematically excluded from all conflict resolution efforts. And she was touched by a number of personal experiences with women that cemented her commitment to creating this network. What she found were that many advantages women capitalized on, that there were many advantages women capitalized on to engage in their community, to create and sustain peace. She demonstrates time and again that fundamental change requires women. She realized that locals in civil society know what's best for locals. Interesting idea. A bottom-up process for planning and decision-making must be used for any sustainable change, and women would be the key to any altered framework. Insights from Ambassador Hunt's decade-long work shows us that local change on the ground, at the grassroots level, works for a number of reasons. First, we find women most prevalent and active outside government in civil society organizations. These women, without weapons and outside positions of formal leadership, are perceived as less threatening to those in power. They can do the work unimpeded. They often use their identity as mothers to cut across international borders and ethnic enclaves. They treat the hardened soldier as a son. They have a huge investment in the stability of their communities. They know their communities. They can sense tensions before conflict breaks out. They can articulate a peace process during violence, and they can figure out how to shape a post-war peace agreement that will be accepted by their communities. Here are some examples. In Sudan, after the 20-year civil war, 1983 to 2005, women worked together in the New Sudan Council of Churches and conducted their own shuttle diplomacy. They organized the 1999 One-Lit Tribal Summit to bring an end to the hostilities. The One-Lit Covenant guaranteed peace among two warring groups. They agreed to share rights to water, fishing, and grazing land, which had been key points of disagreement. Covenant also returned prisoners and permitted freedom of movement for members for both sides. In Liberia, if you have an opportunity to see the documentary Pray the Devil Back to Pray the Devil Back to Hell, you will witness the story of the women around the country physically surrounding the building during the peace talks in Ghana. Women were not allowed to be part of the talks, but women could make the men stay until the peace settlement was arranged. Their threats, no sex at home, exposure of their bodies to the CNNs and BBCs for international view was enough to get their men's attention. There were so many success stories of women's movements for social, economic, and political advancement. These are chronicled also in the book. But if I might highlight one more, the Rosa movement, Women of Zimbabwe Arise. Zimbabwe's conflict between political parties had enormous economic and social ramifications for the entire country, and particularly devastating effects on women. Though Rosa is an acronym, the word itself means come forward. The Rosa movement sought practical and strategic cross-gender needs, including basic social services, access to treatment for the HIV positive, access to affordable basic commodities, economic recovery, democratic transition, inclusive governance. Their advancement is grounded in their role as mother, wife, daughter, sister, ultimately the mothers of the nation. They are an extraordinarily strong coalition now, and many male active members have joined them. And now to how women build sustainable peace and how change can occur that is long-lasting. The result of SCAR graduates, Peace Uwendiza and Sarah Yeaman, Sarah's here, right here, provide us invaluable insight about successful structural changes that can impact gender equality. Peace's latest research for my forthcoming book, Deconstructing Women, Peace and Security, has carefully studied the impact of structural efforts in Rwanda and demonstrates extraordinary success. Dr. Yemen's research, she researched 3 women's movements focused on challenging the crippling patriarchy in Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey. Her meta-analysis identified a number of lessons learned. These lessons are similar to other cases that I've documented this evening. This gendered challenge to understand both the structural violence and essential ways to use structures is important to our work, both as conflict analysts and as conflict interveners. This is what we've learned by the 16 cases that were ways of making change happen. Not in any particular order. Educate girls and women. That's likely to result in greater economic independence, manage natural resources in a more sustainable way. And remember that if you teach women to read, 98% of them will teach their sons and daughters to read, and in a generation or 2, we'll stop the literacy problem. Overcome barriers to schools, to schooling for girls. Promote access to primary, secondary, and higher education for girls, and make sure their space is safe as they get to school. Promote mechanisms that give women voice in politics and governance. Proportional representation systems work. Public funding should be available for campaigns. Promote legislation for equal economic rights for all. Equal pay for equal work, free choice of profession, free choice for employment. Ensure development agendas reach out to women, especially rural and remote areas where violence continues. Government and civil society organizations must join to create economic opportunity structures for women. Provide incentives by donor countries with resources going to gender mainstreaming. The last 2, let women's work count. Create policies on wages, informal employment, unpaid care work. Disseminate women's roles in history using radio, street, theater, television, community education systems, modeling social behavior of equality of all humans, men and women. And finally, provide women access. Help link women to local, regional, and international support networks and social systems. I'm pleased to say that we've come a long way at our school. I cannot imagine having the same sparring conversation about who would be the next Lynch lecturer, who would be most qualified. Today it would go something like this. Agnieszka Pazynski might recommend Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, having just returned from monitoring her re-election as president of Liberia and the first president of African country. And Solon Simmons is likely to respond with either Lema Bowie or Takakoe Carmen. I apologize if I've ruined their names. The other 2 women who were awarded jointly with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize winners. Desmond Tutu could also be recommended, as would the Dalai Lama, as well as perhaps several top-notch academic or practitioners. All would agree each would be terrific, and we could learn from their leadership and knowledge. So there we are. Who's the most qualified? Who could we get to get access to the invitation? But most important, and the population that we now consider, is no longer limited to 50%. If I might now go back to the framework we used when just analyzing deep-rooted conflicts today, you will see why it's important for us to remember in our analysis that the conflicts are embedded with gender, situational, cultural, and structural issues. Before I close, I want to thank the more than 175 master's and doctoral students in the gender course over the years who've contributed to much of this research, who've moved on to lead many of the movements or grassroots efforts, who work in the government sectors, here and abroad, to create and support changes from within, who are in the military, looking at ways women are supported in policy and peacemaking efforts, and who are in the academy, teaching the next generation about these important issues. I'm intrigued by Naomi Wolf's analysis of Occupying Wall Street movement. It seems people who have joined OWS are aligned by consciousness. not nation state or religion or local geographic or tribal boundaries. Perhaps another one of the lessons for change is to build on women's demands for a peaceful life, a sustainable future, economic justice, and basic democracy for both men and women. Thank you.